From New York, this is Democracy Now!
657 U.S. billionaires have seen their combined wealth go up to $1.3 trillion for a combined wealth of $4.2 total trillion. They have benefited from other people's suffering. These are the pandemic profiteers.
A year of pain for so many has seen massive gains for a select few billionaires. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos saw his personal wealth increase by $65 billion, more than $7 million every hour. We'll look at the top pandemic profiteers. Then the House Armed Services Committee holds a hearing on extremism in the armed forces.
We know 1 in 5 of those arrested in connection with the deadly January 6th Capitol insurrection riots has served or is serving in the military. This is a dramatic illustration of the insufficient efforts we have made to inoculate service members against acting upon extremist ideologies.
We'll speak with Leisha Brooks with the Southern Poverty Law Center, who testified at the hearing. Then a massive fire at a Rohingya refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, kills 15, displaces at least 45,000, with hundreds still missing.
Families were separated. Some children are still looking for their parents. This is a very, very difficult situation, and our heart goes out to the thousands of refugees who have yet met another disaster.
We'll get an update from a Rohingya activist. And as the world's worst humanitarian crisis enters its 7th year this week in Yemen, we'll speak with the head of the Yemen Data Project about the massive civilian death toll of the U.S.-backed Saudi-led air war. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A group of Democratic lawmakers in Colorado are considering a new ban on assault-style weapons after 10 people died in a mass shooting at a grocery store in Boulder Monday. Republicans in Colorado oppose the ban and are pushing for more money for mental health services. The accused Boulder gunman is scheduled to appear in court today for the first time. In a major legal decision, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit has ruled states may bar people from openly carrying guns in public. The ruling could impact right-to-carry laws across the West and Hawaii and Alaska. Meanwhile, nearly 20,000 people died in the United States from gun violence last year, more than any year in at least 2 decades. This, according to the Gun Violence Archive. Gun sales also jumped by 64% in 2020, with some 23 million guns sold in the United States. President Biden's tapped Vice President Kamala Harris to oversee an effort to slow the high number of migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. There are now over 15,000 unaccompanied migrant children in U.S. custody. Harris spoke at the White House Wednesday.
While we are clear that people should not come to the border now, we also understand that we will enforce the law, and that we also, because we can chew gum and walk at the same time, must address the root causes that cause people to make the trek, as the president has described, to come here.
President Biden's holding his first news conference since taking office today. He's expected to face questions about the border. On Wednesday, the Pentagon approved a plan to temporarily house unaccompanied migrant children at 2 Texas military bases. The Environmental Protection Agency has faulted the private prison company Geo Group for using a pesticide as a coronavirus disinfectant up to 50 times a day at the Adelanto Detention Center in California. Immigrant prisoners reported nosebleeds, fainting, headaches, and stomach pain after being exposed to the pesticide. President Biden's now deported more Haitians over the past 2 months than President Trump did in the previous year, even though the Biden administration admits Haitians, quote, may face harm after being deported. Haiti is in the midst of a political and economic crisis. At least 1,300 Haitians, including hundreds of children and infants, have been deported since February 1st. The most recent deportation flight took place Wednesday. The COVID-19 death toll in Brazil has topped 300,000, the second highest in the world after the United States. More than 5,000 Brazilians have died over the past 2 days. Brazil's hospital system is on the brink of collapse with widespread oxygen shortages. Here in the United States, the total number of cases has topped 30 million, with the death toll now over 546,000. Meanwhile, Israel's become the first country to fully vaccinate more than half of its adult population, but few Palestinians living in the occupied territories have been vaccinated. On Wednesday, Doctors Without Borders urged Israel to immediately help slow the spread of COVID in the occupied territories where cases are spiking. The Senate has held its first hearing on the For the People Act, the most sweeping voting rights bill in decades. The legislation has already been approved by the House. Senate Democrats say it's needed to counter efforts at the state level by Republicans to restrict the right to vote. Since the 2020 election, Republican state lawmakers have introduced over 250 bills in 43 states to limit voter access. This is Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
Instead of doing what you should be doing when you lose an election in a democracy, attempting to win over those voters in the next election, Republicans instead are trying to disenfranchise those voters. Shame on them.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell called the effort to protect voting rights a, quote, power grab.
This is clearly an effort by one party to rewrite the rules of our political system.
In other voting news, lawmakers in Washington state have passed a bill to automatically restore voting rights for people who are on parole and probation. The United States and European countries have announced new plans to work together to counter China. On Wednesday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke at NATO headquarters and claimed China was a threat to other NATO nations.
There's no question that Beijing's coercive behavior threatens our collective security and prosperity, and that it is actively working to undercut the rules of the international system and the values we and our allies share.
Earlier this week, the United States, the European Union, Britain and Canada imposed new sanctions on Chinese officials over the mistreatment of Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. China then accused Western nations of having a hypocritical stance on human rights, citing U.S. wars in the Middle East, systematic racism in the United States, the French slaughter of Algerians during colonial rule, and the Holocaust. Meanwhile, Facebook has removed a group of suspected China-based hackers accused of using the platform to help spy on Uyghur exiles, as well as journalists and activists. Virginia has become the first state in the South to outlaw capital punishment. Democratic Governor Ralph Northam signed legislation Wednesday abolishing the death penalty.
I can say that the death penalty is fundamentally flawed. Most importantly, we know that the system doesn't always get it right.
Since 1976, when the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty, Virginia's carried out 113 executions, more than any state besides Texas. In Argentina, thousands marched in Buenos Aires Wednesday to mark the 45th anniversary of the 1976 coup that ushered in a bloody U.S.-backed dictatorship under which as many as 30,000 people were killed and disappeared. Lita Boitano is the president of Families of the Disappeared and Detained for Political Reasons.
What I am feeling is that I never felt my children so close like this year. My children are part of the 30,000 disappeared. They are part of the group that are never named or that are barely named, the more than 10,000 political prisoners, the thousands killed by the genocidal dictatorship.
Meanwhile, the National Security Archive has revealed new details about how the U.S. government was in direct contact with the coup plotters in Argentina prior to the overthrow of Isabel Perón's government March 24, 1976. Declassified documents show then CIA Director George H.W. Bush briefed President Gerald Ford on a possible coup almost 2 weeks before it happened. The U.S. government also told the Argentine military in advance it would recognize the new regime. At the time, the State Department was privately acknowledging a coup would lead to, quote, military rule for an extended duration and of unprecedented severity. The U.S.-backed dictatorship in Argentina would continue until 1983. Kim Janey has been sworn in as mayor of Boston, making her the first woman and first person of color to hold the office. She replaces Marty Walsh, the new U.S. Labor Secretary. Janey vowed to fight Boston's wealth gap.
Today, in the city of Boston, we have an enormous wealth gap. The median net worth for Black families is just $8. $8 is not an accident. It is the product of discriminatory policies that we have all inherited. We need to call it out, and we need to implement new policies to address it.
While the median net worth of Black families in Boston is just $8, the median net worth of white families in Boston is nearly $250,000, nearly 31,000 times as much. A new report's revealed the world's 60 largest banks lent more than $3.8 trillion for fossil fuel projects since 2016, following the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement. Top lenders included J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citibank, and the Bank of China. NBC New York's revealed the New York Police Department's issued over 217,000 secret subpoenas to force Internet providers and other companies to hand over personal information for tens of thousands of people for so-called internal investigations. Targets of the subpoenas include journalists and officers who criticize the NYPD. One target was Philip Ansardi, who retired from the department in 1993. He was alerted by Microsoft after the NYPD demanded access to all of his emails, citing a provision under the USA Patriot Act.
It wasn't created to go after a retired cop who goes tuna fishing. That's not the Patriot Act. Absolutely shocking that they were abusing or are abusing the Patriot Act to investigate civilians.
One retired police captain compared the NYPD to the Gestapo. The Senate has confirmed Dr. Rachel Levine to be Assistant Secretary of Health. She becomes the first openly transgender official to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And President Biden signed a proclamation Wednesday to mark Equal Pay Day, a day which marks how far women must work into the new year to earn what men made on average in the previous year. This is U.S. soccer star Megan Rapinoe speaking at a congressional hearing.
It's just unacceptable that we're still fighting for equal pay. And I feel like, honestly, we've done everything. You want stadiums filled, we've filled them. You want role models for your kids, for your boys and your girls, and your little trans kids, we have that. You want us to be respectful. You want us to perform on the world stage. You want us to take the stars and stripes and the red, white, and blue across the entire globe and represent America in the best way possible. We've done all of that, and simply there's no reason why we're underpaid for the exception of gender.
That's soccer star Megan Rapinoe. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York with co-host Nermeen Sheikh.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, it's been a year of pain for so many and massive gains for a select few billionaires. We begin today's show looking at a new report that names the biggest pandemic profiteers over the past year. As unemployment surged at the start of the lockdowns, the Institute for Policy Studies began working with Americans for Tax Fairness to track the wealth growth of U.S. billionaires. They've just published their findings that show the combined wealth of the 657 billionaires in the country grew more than $1.3 trillion, nearly 45% since the pandemic began. This comes as a record number of people in the United States lost their jobs and struggled to put food on the table. Food banks reported massive lines, and mutual aid groups popped up across the United States to help those in need. This is Harlem resident Ruth Crawford speaking from a food bank last Thanksgiving.
You have to try to relax and think of the better things, because it wasn't always like this. But this is getting to people, and it's just sad. I mean, you work all the time, and you can't go to work, or you can't work from home, so it's not easy.
Billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg all saw their bank accounts swell amidst the global crisis. This month, Senators Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders and others proposed an ultra-millionaire tax to tax fortunes above $50 million. Senator Sanders hosted a hearing on the inequality crisis last week.
We'll be asking about how it happens that the top 1/10 of 1% now owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. 0.1% more wealth than the bottom 90%. And two individuals, Bezos and Musk, now own more wealth than the bottom 40%. And meanwhile, we're looking at more hunger in America than at any time in decades.
Senator Sanders is holding another hearing today. For more, we're joined by Chuck Collins, director of the Institute for Policy Studies program on inequality and author of their new report, A Year of Billionaire Pandemic Gains. Chuck Collins is also the author of The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions. Chuck, welcome back to Democracy Now! Who are the pandemic profiteers and how they do it?
Well, good morning, Amy. And you mentioned a couple who, like Jeff Bezos, like Elon Musk. But what we found was that there was a whole group of people, almost 50 billionaires, whose wealth has gone up over 100%. And they are often leading companies who have benefited from the pandemic conditions by having essentially their competition shut down. So they're the online retailers, the online telemedicine. And then think about it, any of the companies that we're sort of depending on while a bricks and mortar economy has been shut down, those are the ones that have seen their wealth surge dramatically. And as you said, we're talking about 657 billionaires whose combined wealth is, 1.3 trillion increase in the last year, but they have 4.2 trillion total, which is almost double the amount of the wealth of the bottom half of U.S. households. So these folks have reaped enormous windfalls in this pandemic.
Chuck, could you also respond to the ultra-millionaire tax proposals that Sanders was just talking about, what we played? And also, in 2018, you wrote that the effective rate of tax on the billionaire class was lower than for most middle-income taxpayers. Explain what the effective rate of tax is, and again, your response to the proposal for an ultra-millionaire tax.
Well, it really is a good time to be talking about taxing the very wealthy. The effective rate is really what's the percentage of your income and wealth that you pay in taxes, and the billionaire class is down to about 23%, which is like a 70-year low. That's the level at which many school teachers pay their tax rates. So a wealth tax along the lines, the ultramillionaire tax that's been proposed. Senator Sanders is going to introduce his reformed estate tax bill, the 99.5% bill today. Those are the kinds of legislation that will raise significant money from that billionaire class. We estimated, Americans for Tax Fairness and Institute for Policy Studies estimated that the wealth tax, half the revenue, would come from billionaires. Over 10 years, almost $1.5 trillion of revenue would come just from billionaires. So it would go a long way toward making the tax system more fair and restoring the lost progressivity that we had in past decades.
And Chuck, it's clear that, of course, the U.S. was not the only country that saw billionaires increasing their wealth exponentially during the pandemic. There's another report that tracks global wealth called the Hurun Global Rich List, and it found that in addition to billionaires, of course, increasing their wealth, the world also added 607 new billionaires, and that's 3 billionaires every 2 days. So could you talk about how this happened globally and where this wealth is most concentrated, the U.S., China, and India?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we're going to release an analysis of the 1-year mark on global wealth, but let me give you a preview. The global billionaire class, there's about 2,360 billionaires globally. Their wealth increased $4 trillion, so that group has $12 trillion. And if we were to levy a kind of Warren-style wealth tax on the global billionaires, just in 1 year, that would raise about $350 billion. It would cost about $140 billion to vaccinate the world. according to Oxfam. So, that's the juxtaposition that we're looking at in the pandemic. But the common thing that these billionaires have, the ones that are really extracting enormous windfalls, is their Main Street business commerce competition has been shut down. I mean, it's clear, take an example like Amazon, the Main Street bookstore and retailer is shuttered. They're consolidating. These bigger billionaire-owned companies are consolidating their ownership in certain sectors, and it's both the things that we need. It's also diversions. Snapchat, sort of gaming, online gaming. All those things have also there's a huge amount of wealth that's been extracted from these companies that own some of the online gaming firms. And the United States billionaires only account for less than a third of this global wealth. There's a tremendous amount of new wealth in China, in Hong Kong. But what they all have in common is they benefit from the adversity and the artificial conditions that the pandemic has created in the marketplace.
I wanted to go back to Jeff Bezos. Earlier this week, we spoke to Stuart Applebaum, president of the Retail, Wholesale and Department Store Union, talking about how Amazon treated workers during the pandemic. They're attempting to unionize the first Amazon warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama.
Amazon cut people's wages in the middle of the pandemic. At the end of May, they eliminated the $2 hazard pay they had been giving, even though the pandemic continued to rage, even though the hazards were just as bad, if not worse, as they had been before. And why did they do it? They didn't do it because they needed to. You talked about how much money Bezos has made during this period. They did it because they thought they could get away with it. Oxfam put out a report that said if Jeff Bezos had given every one of his employees a bonus of $105,000, Bezos still would have been wealthier at the end of the pandemic than he was at the beginning.
So let's talk about that, Chuck. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos saw his personal wealth increase by $65 billion, more than $7 million every hour. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking with Danny Glover, who is going down along with Bernie Sanders and others for the final push days of the Amazon unionization drive effort in Bessemer. The significance of them fighting, spending millions fighting this unionization, and yet you look at the massive pandemic profiteering that he is engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that Bezos, and Amazon hired 450,000 new workers during the pandemic globally, 800,000 workers now in the U.S. Many of them were sent into the viral line of fire with inadequate protection. I've talked to lots of Amazon workers in warehouses in the north where even they are unionized in some cases, but they are still, being forced to work in unsafe conditions. Amazon could have done so much more. They could have kept hazard pay in place. They could allow workers to organize. They could share the wealth with their employees, but instead they've hoarded the wealth at the top. The average Amazon worker has seen their pay go up less than $1 over the year, but compared to Bezos's, as you point out, thousands of dollars an hour that he's reaping from the situation. So it's really great that people like Danny Glover and others are standing and organizing, standing with the workers in Alabama in their struggle, because this is a pivotal moment to push back on these sort of oligarchic owners. Same with Musk. Musk, again, sending his workers back into the factories without adequate protection, while these billionaires sit in their own protective bubbles.
We want to thank you so much, Chuck Collins, and we're going to link to your report. Chuck Collins is director of the Institute for Policy Studies Program on Inequality. That new report, A Year of Billionaire Pandemic Gains. He's the author of The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions. Next up, the House Armed Services Committee holds a hearing on extremism in the armed forces. 1 in 5 of those arrested in connection with the deadly January 6th Capitol insurrection have served or are now serving in the military. Stay with us.
The lawyer and the pharmacist when walking through paradise. Dress suits in a courtroom, aroma of chloroform. And they smiled at the judge, disposition so sunny. 'Cause they didn't have the cure, but sure needed the money. What a strange, strange world we live in, where the good are damned and the wicked forgiven. What a strange, strange world we live in. Those who don't have lose, those who got get given. More, 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 more.
The Trapper and the Furrier by Regina Spektor. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. The Armed Services Committee of the House held a hearing Wednesday on extremism in the U.S. military to look at how nearly 1 in 5 people who are facing charges related to the deadly January 6th insurrection at the Capitol had served or are serving in the military, including at least 2 active duty troops. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in January ordered a 60-day stand-down across the force to address extremism. The first deadline is coming up on April 6th. But Republicans on the committee used their time to cast doubt on the need for the hearing. This is Texas Congressman Pat Fallon.
Let's look at the data we do have. Our office reached out to all 4 branches of the service and asked one simple question. How many members of your branch were separated last year due to extremist activities? The Marine Corps gave us the data. Out of 222,000 current and active duty reservists and active duty Marines, a total of 4 were separated last year for extremist activity, leaving us once again with an infinitesimally tiny figure of 1 out of 55,475. This isn't a hearing about the readiness of our armed forces. It's nothing more, unfortunately, than political theater.
That's Republican Congressmember Fallon. He drew this response from the committee chair, Adam Smith.
We'll just point out a couple of simple little math issues. 20% of the people that have been arrested from the Capitol Hill riots had a history of serving in the military, one way or the other. To then say that, well, those are the only people in the military that could possibly be involved in extremism is simply logically absurd, and I'm sure the gentleman would recognize that. We don't know for sure how large the problem is. That's why we're having the hearing.
One of the experts asked to testify at Wednesday's hearing was Leisha Brooks, chief of staff at the Southern Poverty Law Center, who said the military has long failed to adequately address far-right extremism in the ranks.
Let me begin with 2 distinct points. First, the vast majority of those who serve in our armed forces have no connection to white supremacy or extremism and strive always to uphold the best traditions of our nation's democratic ideals. Second, the military has a growing problem with white supremacy and extremism, because our country does. The white nationalist movement in the United States is surging and presents a serious danger to our country and its cherished institutions, threatening the morale and good order of those serving in our armed forces.
That's Leisha Brooks, chief of staff at the Southern Poverty Law Center, testifying at yesterday's Armed Services Committee hearing on extremism in the armed forces. She joins us now for more. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Leisha. Can you talk about this critical issue? I mean, 1 in 5 of those charged have served or are serving in the military, not to mention the police and in those intelligence. This part of the January 6th insurrection. The significance of this, an issue you've been covering for years.
That is correct. The Southern Poverty Law Center has really been looking at this issue for decades, dating back to 1986 when we first wrote Secretary Weinberger. And it's important to note that people who are connected with the military are prime targets for extremists. They have leadership skills that are valuable. They have intelligence that is valuable. They are actively recruited prior to joining the military. They're recruited while they're in the military. And we take great risk in not looking at their connections to extremism as they separate from the military.
And Leisha, could you lay out the recommendations that you presented to Congress yesterday?
Yes, thank you. And we just really want to commend Chairman Smith for holding the hearings. And as we understand it, they've never held a full hearing ever on this topic. And as was brought up a lot yesterday, there's a lack of data. And as we know, data drives policy. There are inconsistent policies across our military forces. We're calling for data collection, additional training, and support services in terms of building resilience for those that separate and are re-entering civilian life.
And Leisha, I'd like to turn to the first Black Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, speaking to 60 Minutes earlier this month during an interview about extremism in the ranks.
There's probably not a job that I had since I was a lieutenant colonel where some people didn't question whether or not I was qualified to take that job. It's the world I live in, and I'm sure that the other officers that you talk to would probably say the same thing. There's not a day in my life, David, when I didn't wake up and think about the fact that I was a black man.
So, Leisha, your response to that, the significance of Austin being in this position, and also the steps that he's taken so far to address the question of hate and extremism in the military.
Nareem, we're very encouraged by Secretary Austin's ascension to the head of the Department of Defense. One, because not simply because he's an African American, and he mentioned in his own words, he has faced racial discrimination for his entire life. It's also important to note that he experienced firsthand white supremacists in the military, so he knows that it exists and that it has existed for some time. That 60 Minutes broadcast was so difficult to hear. Not only did we hear from Secretary Austin, but we also heard from the head of the Air Force, who talked about similar experiences with racial discrimination. And we know that based on Military Times surveys, they survey active duty service members, and each year for the last 3 years, it goes up where service members report that they've seen and witnessed white nationalists or white supremacy on base and within the ranks. So the members yesterday who questioned the data, who questioned the prevalence of white supremacy or extremism, the Southern Poverty Law Center was certainly brought to talk about our expertise with respect to white nationalist infiltration. There is a problem with extremism, and we need to do a better job in terms of regulations, enforcement across all branches of the military.
I want to go back to yesterday's hearing. Let's go to a question to you about Confederate symbols from New Jersey Democratic Congressman Donald Norcross.
You speak about removing symbols across the military, in particular the Confederate flag. Why is that important? Give us a historical perspective. Here we are in 2021. Why that's a problem?
As you know, the Confederacy stood against the Union. And in addition, the Confederacy was formed to protect and prolong the inhumane institution of chattel slavery in the United States. We believe that it is wrong for a military that embraces all people to hold up as heroes those who fought to continue the enslavement of African Americans.
So that's our guest, Leisha Brooks of the Southern Poverty Law Center. There isn't a question. The military pours a lot into routing out and going after if there were foreign infiltrators in the U.S. military, you know, related to al-Qaeda or whatever. Do you see anything like that kind of those resources going in to rout out white supremacists? Clearly, in all the reports of the Pentagon and intelligence, the #1 domestic terror threat in this country.
That is true. No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, we are just getting at the place, Amy, where we can talk about white supremacy and white nationalism. The Southern Poverty Law Center, we presented last year to a subcommittee of the armed services, and they could barely say the word white supremacy or white nationalism. So at least we are thankful that the conversation is moving forward. And again, I think it's extremely important that we have Secretary Austin who recognizes that it exists. So we are hopeful. And we're hopeful in terms of this president and the Secretary of Defense. I was more hopeful prior to yesterday's testimony about the committee, but they're, again, giving credit to Chairman Smith. I do believe that they will do all that they can to ensure that we engage in robust data collection, that regulations are uniform across all branches of service, that the regulations pertaining to active participation in these extremist groups is taken seriously.
Did you see what happened on January 6th as an attempt of white supremacists to take over the Capitol?
Oh, my goodness, yes. The Southern Poverty Law Center, as you know, tracks and monitors hate and extremist groups. What we saw on January 6th was a coalescing of not only traditional bad actors or white supremacist groups, but also conspiracy theorists. So when we talk about extremists, we're talking about groups that believe that their in-group success is dependent upon taking hostile action against an out-group. So what we're seeing is a coming together of people who adopt a true white supremacist ideology, along with others who are feeling aggrieved and feeling advance the false narrative that there's white displacement across the country. So we could easily say that there are 50 million people who have been exposed to extremist ideology and have bought into a narrative of false information. And that is represented in the larger society. So, of course, it's represented within the military.
Leisha Brooks, I want to thank you for being with us, Chief of Staff of the Southern Poverty Law Center, expert on extremism in the military. When we come back, we get an update on a massive fire at a Rohingya refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. And then we'll look at Yemen. Stay with us. Jerry. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we turn to Bangladesh, where a massive fire at a Rohingya refugee camp in Cox's Bazar killed at least 15 people and displaced at least 45,000 Monday, with hundreds possibly still missing. At least 17,000 shelters were leveled after the blaze ripped through the crowded camp, leaving behind scenes of utter destruction and despair as people were separated from their loved ones.
We have lost everything. My husband and with my 2 children came out of the fire, but one of my children is still missing.
Bangladeshi authorities are investigating the cause of the fire. Nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees live in southern Bangladesh, often in squalid and dangerous conditions, after fleeing a brutal military crackdown in Burma in 2017. This comes as Burma has been in turmoil for nearly 2 months after a military coup February 1st that deposed the civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi and set off mass nationwide protests. The deadly crackdown on demonstrators has killed at least 286 people in Burma, according to a local rights group. For more, we are joined by Tun Kim, Rohingya activist, president of the Burmese Rohingya Organization UK. Cox's Bazar is the world's largest refugee camp. It houses nearly 900,000 Rohingya refugees who fled violence and persecution in Burma. Welcome to Democracy Now! Describe the conditions on the ground now in this refugee camp, and then we'll talk about what this means in the midst of the even further military crackdown from where they fled in Burma.
Thank you for having me. And it is very, very tragic moment for the Rohingya people. We are receiving very serious conditions, the people of Rohingya people in Bangladesh. As far as what we know now so far, at least 20 Rohingyas were died during the fire. 45,000 people become displaced, and 460 over the people they are injured during the fire. So it is very worrying situation. What can happen tomorrow for these people? Our Rohingya brothers and sisters, they fled when their life was at risk in Burma because of genocidal acts from Burmese military in 2017. They fled. Now they are having this problem. Is unbelievable. I have no word to express. I receive many videos and many calls from our brothers and sisters. This is really, really a tragic moment for us, and international community have to take serious action, support assistance and medical care and supporting them psychologically. And there is much more need to be done, to be honest, I can say.
And Tunkin, can you, what was your response to how the Bangladeshi government responded to the fire? There was a camp inhabitant who was quoted in the New York Times as saying that if the Bangladeshi government had wanted to intervene earlier and stop the fire, they could have.
Bangladesh government giving shelters, protection to the Rohingya refugees, about 1 million people. We really appreciate Bangladesh government, and Bangladesh government, but the people of Bangladesh have shown solidarity and hospitality to the Rohingya people. We will never forget it. At this moment, what's happened, during the fire, Bangladesh government should be done much more, intervene to stop that. Unfortunately, there is barbed wire that prevent to escape the victims. That is very, very important that barbed wire shouldn't be there, That is, Bangladesh government should consider it. I request Bangladesh government should do more, and we appreciate and we always express our thanks to the people of Bangladesh and government of Bangladesh, what they are giving the genocide survivors, 1 million people giving shelter.
Tunkin, could you respond to the impact of the coup in Burma on the condition of the Rohingya who are still there, as well as the ones in the camp, and explain specifically who the coup leader is in Burma, Min Aung Hlaing, and his role in the persecution of the Rohingya?
This is Min Aung Hlaing. He ordered to kill thousands of Rohingya people in 2017. He ordered to rape thousands of Rohingya women. He ordered to burn alive Rohingya children in 2017 in front of their parents. And at least 380 villages were burned down by his order, That is what happened in 2017. He is the most wanted. He committed genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, against other minorities. He committed genocide against Rohingya. So he is very brutal. We are worried what can happen. 600,000 Rohingyas are in Burma now. They are still facing genocide. They're not allowed to move from one village to another, not getting access to medical care, not getting access to education. So He is the person now he's military coup leader now. We can see on the streets of Rangoon, Mandalay, and other cities in Burma what brutality military is doing. So last about 2 months now, I can feel the pain what our brothers and sisters in Rohingya in 2017 faced. The same pain I can feel for the people of Burma, our brothers and sisters in Rangoon, Mandalay, Taunji. Today 4 people were killed, and other cities. So we are showing our solidarity with our brothers and sisters of our country, from solidarity with our brothers and sisters from our country. We can paint the feeling what they are facing, and you can imagine how brutality they have done to Rohingyas. Even now in the cities, Rangoon is the largest city. At the city, they're coming into their house and grabbing the people, and they're firing bullets from straight to at the middle of the day and nights, and raiding houses. Continually, this is going on. And can you imagine?
You mentioned
7 years.
Go ahead.
7 years old child was, killed by these military terrorists. We are calling them military terrorists, of military terrorists. Me Online is the terrorist leader. People are not calling them Myanmar army, not Temedor. They are military terrorists in Burma,
Well, Tunkin, you mentioned earlier what you would like the international community to do. Now, the U.S. As well as the EU have put sanctions on many of the military leaders, including Min Aung Hlaing, who were involved in the coup. What else do you think needs to be done? And also speak about the role of China. You've been very critical of the role that China has played.
Definitely, it's been 2 months almost now. We have lost 270 people so far. 270 people were killed who are unarmed civilian, peaceful protesters were killed by this Myanmar terrorist military. We have not seen practical action from international community yet. How many more lives we have to lose to take action from international community? Every day the people were killed by this Myanmar terrorist military. Every day. Today 4 people in Taunji, yesterday and the day before yesterday. So they are enjoying impunity. One thing, international community, they did not take much action. 2017, thousands of Rohingya were killed, and that there is no such action we have seen so far from international community to take, to punish Min Aung Hlaing military criminal Min Aung Hlaing and other generals. That encouraged them, that emboldened them to move forward with enjoying impunity. That is a very important thing. International community, UN Security Council, we are appealing referral to ICC Burma, situation of Burma, and military companies need to be sanctioned. International community must cut off military financial institution. That is the most important thing. That military financial, if you can cut off, they can collapse, because military institution, they got a lot of money. So international community stop investing, cutting off military tie and sanction military companies, and diplomatic also sanctions needed. And same time, UN Secretary General and Security Council, they have to visit Burma to look at what is happening on the ground. So how international community, we appreciate their concern, and they doing individual visa ban. These are not enough. The military general, they told to UN Special Envoy, they used to it. They don't care. So we need to look at much more. to focus what action can take, and global arms embargo, that is important. And U.S. companies, UK, European companies should not invest in Burma at all.
Tun King, we're going to have to leave it there, but we want to thank you very much for being with us. And, of course, we're going to continue to follow this. Rohingya activist, president of the Burmese Rohingya Organization, UK. As we move now into our last segment on Yemen, where the world's worst humanitarian crisis enters its 7th year this week. The World Food Programme warned this month that Yemen's headed toward the biggest famine in modern history, projecting around 400,000 Yemeni children under the age of 5 could die from acute malnutrition this year as the Saudi war and blockade continues, unfortunately backed by the United States. Now, a new report by the Yemen Data Project summarizes the impact of the past 6 years of air raids. It found the bombing campaign has, on average, killed almost 1,500 civilians every year, a quarter of them children. For more, we're joined by Iona Craig, award-winning journalist who heads the Yemen Data Project with colleagues in Yemen. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us from Britain now. Can you talk about what's happening on this, to say the least, sad anniversary?
Well, the data tells us now that there have been almost 23,000 air raids, and that really covers almost 66,000 individual airstrikes since the war began in March 2015. So you're looking at least 10 air raids every day with an average of up to 30 individual airstrikes. And although the rate of air raids has fallen from around 2018 until 2020, we then saw an increase again last year for the first time since then, and an 83% increase in air raids. So although there has continued to be a decline in civilian casualties, we're still seeing now an increase in air raids in 2020, despite a 45-day ceasefire. So this has been an ongoing campaign, obviously, that originally in the first 2 years was causing civilian casualties on a rate in the first year of 9,445 casualties, civilian casualties in the first year of the air war. That dropped significantly over the years and was down to 147 last year, but we're still seeing mass civilian casualty events. One of the most deadly airstrikes in the air war was in 2019. We're still seeing a large number of airstrikes on residential areas and, of course, on civilian infrastructure, which has been absolutely decimated over the last 6 years of the conflict. We've seen 86 strikes on medical facilities, for example. We've seen 800 air raids on transport infrastructure, 150 air raids on water and electricity facilities, and the list goes on, really. So the damage that has been done to civilian infrastructure in the country will go into the hundreds of millions of dollars, as well of course, impacting the humanitarian crisis that the country is now facing.
Iona, could you talk about, Saudi Arabia has been responsible for the vast majority of these airstrikes, of course, but could you talk about also the involvement of other Gulf states, the UAE, for example, and precisely what kind of support the U.S. has been giving to these airstrike operations?
Well, we know the United Arab Emirates has been playing a leading role in the air war in particular. It is one of the main nations in the region involved in the air campaign. What we don't know from the data that we collect is which individual states are responsible for individual strikes. We don't know that from the data that we gather. It is all from open source, so it's very hard to tell which individual nations, whether it be Saudi Arabia, whether it be the United Arab Emirates, or it be other countries like Jordan that may be responsible for individual strikes on particular targets. But this is part of the problem and one of the reasons why the data is being collected. There is a a severe lack of accountability and transparency in the airstrikes that are happening. Unlike in Syria and Iraq, where you will have Western nations who are part of the coalition carrying out airstrikes, at least providing some information on the strikes that they are carrying out as far as data is concerned. There is nothing in Yemen. This is the only sort of data collection on the air war that gives information on both the targets and the civilian casualties in the conflict as part of the bombing campaign. Saudi Arabia has not given out any regular information on airstrikes at all. They've done some self-policing where there have been claims of violations of international humanitarian law, where there have been mass civilian casualty events as a result of the bombing campaign, but those are only on a handful of incidents. So this data is really crucial to getting an overall understanding of the state of the air war, the civilian casualties that happened, and the damage that is being done to Yemen's infrastructure.
And earlier this week, Saudi Arabia actually proposed a ceasefire, but the Houthis rejected the deal, saying it offers nothing new. And Human Rights Watch also recently came out with a report condemning the Houthi rebels, saying they've been attacking displaced people's camp. And you have said that both Houthis and Saudi Arabia, their de facto blockade, is what's led to Yemenis starving. So could you talk about the role that the Houthis have been playing increasingly in recent years and what they've been responsible for in terms of the destruction of Yemen's infrastructure?
Well, I think one of the things we have to focus on here is the fact that when the fighting happens in residential areas, that's where the most civilian casualties occur. So, for example, in the air war, only 10% of air raids are actually in residential areas, but they cause 40% of the civilian casualties. And that's particularly important at the moment because the Houthis have been pushing this offensive on the city of Marib. And that puts so many people in danger. As we know, there are over 1 million people who have been displaced to the city of Marib and around there. That then means that you'll have displaced camps that are being targeted both by ground forces and potentially in airstrikes as well. So the concern, particularly at the moment, is for civilians in Marib, that we may see then an increase in civilian casualties purely because there is increased violence both in the air war and in the ground war that has been pushed by the Houthis in the last few weeks because of their uptick in fighting and an attempt to take the city of Marib. But we've seen this time and time again in the conflict. When residential areas become a focus of the fighting, whether that be in places like Taiz or in Aden earlier on in the conflict, that's when you will see more airstrikes in those areas and more civilian casualties. And Taiz, the city of Taiz and the governorate has been one of the most heavily hit. It's second most heavily hit governorate in the country, and with civilian casualties reflecting that as well. And so for every single air raid there is in a residential area, there are at least 3 civilian casualties. And this is what the concern is over Marib at the moment.
Iona, finally, we have a new administration in the United States, right? President Biden was elected. Says he's taking a different approach to Saudi Arabia. Do you see a difference when it comes to Yemen? What do you think the Biden administration should be doing?
Well, we'll certainly be looking, as far as the data is concerned, on whether that does have an effect. It's probably a little bit early to tell at the moment. There was a 27% month-on-month reduction in air raids in February of this year. And that's the lowest monthly rate in more than a year of air raids. Whether that's indicative of what the announcements made by the Biden administration, it's probably a little bit early to tell. But of course, the hope is that it will have also an impact on the parties to the conflict, particularly in the case at the moment between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis coming to some kind of at least political talks and an attempt at a ceasefire, which the Saudis have already announced. Unfortunately, although the Saudis announced that they wanted a ceasefire, we've still seen airstrikes happening in the first 24 hours of that.
Iona Craig, we're going to have to leave it there, but we thank you for being with us, and of course we'll continue to cover Yemen. Iona Craig is a journalist who heads up the Yemen Data Project. We'll link to your latest report. Before we end, Nermeen, I wanted to wish you a very happy pre-birthday.
Another pandemic birthday.
Well, it's going to end soon. And we will be together. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks for joining us.